Brian slept on the couch that night, while Daniel curled himself into the huge armchair. Almost 2 hours after the initial ordeal, the Hulk had come lumbering back into the main room. He'd silently laid out blankets and pillows, a haunted look to his broad face, and then lumbered back out again, without a word. "You think he's—" Brian trailed off. "I don't know," Daniel said. "But I'm not gonna ask." Brian just nodded. Daniel had a rough time falling asleep. They both did, unsurprisingly, but Daniel was still wide awake even by the time Brian started snoring around 4 in the morning. The moon had swept over the house and was now peering through the trees and into the sliding glass doors, casting blue lace patterns on the rugs and walls. Daniel stared out at it, his eyes burning, body aching with exhaustion, completely unable to sleep. There were soft footsteps behind him. The Hulk was standing in the doorway to the hall, looking into the room with one hand resting on the doorframe. "How is he?" Daniel whispered. The Hulk was only a mountainous silhouette in the darkness. "Alive," he answered, which was not what Daniel had asked, but rather what he had wanted to know. "I'm sorry," Daniel said, suddenly finding tears springing to his eyes, his throat tight. "I'm really, really sorry. I just stood there and—" "Everybody freezes up sometimes, kid," the Hulk said. "Try and get some sleep." And his massive silhouette slipped back into the hallway. Daniel cried harder, but only partially out of guilt now. This man who had nearly lost everything, because Daniel had stood there like an idiot instead of doing something, had still had the courtesy and grace to try and make Daniel feel better about it. He was a saint, a bodhisattva, and Daniel wondered why he'd ever thought otherwise. Some people were just full of surprises. "Daniel?" Brian croaked from the couch. "You okay?" Sniffling and trying to sound as normal as possible, he replied, "Yeah, I'm fine." "Okay," said Brian, and rolled over, and was soon snoring again. Daniel looked out at the moon, waning gibbous and brilliantly white, and fancied he could pick out the glint and gleam of Novigorod, the moon's capital city, sparkling in the midst of the sea of tranquility. It was probably just his eyes playing tricks on him. Novi was nearly invisible from Earth, even on a good night when the moon was full and the air was still. Nevertheless, there was something oddly comforting about seeing, or imagining, the little outpost of humanity twinkling in the night, something secure in knowing that whatever happened down here amongst the green and blue, there were backups of the human genome saved and stored safely on a remote drive, walking and talking and filming each other falling on their asses in the strange low-gravity environment. Immensely farther off, somewhere behind the limb of the earth, was Mars as well, with its provisional colonies and frontier towns. Mars, Moon, Earth. That trio had given new meaning to the red, white, and blue, a set of colors America and Russia proudly shared and proudly and loudly referenced back to their 3 chosen worlds. Even farther away, beyond Mars, were the tiny mining cities clinging like leeches to the skins of the largest asteroids out in the main belt. Cities that were prisons. Prisons that were cities. Hundreds of thousands of people from all over Earth, breaking their backs to dig up the precious materials their planet-side cousins craved so dearly. Oddly enough, rather than the expected commodities of gold or fuel, it ended up being plain old water that had become most precious. Water to send to the moon and Mars, to dig up and melt and purify and refreeze and ship out to the bone-dry wastelands of red and silver to keep the immense human hard drives from being wiped. And somewhere up there, spinning dark against the darkness, was Daniel's father, his papa, not buried, not cremated, but floating cold and aimless in space, because there wasn't room to bury him, and there wasn't air to burn him, and there wasn't fuel to send him home. Somewhere out there was Minamine's brother, Dylan's uncle, Alan's sister, Annika's fiancé, all frozen and lifeless and lost in the darkness. Lost, Daniel thought, but certainly not forgotten. Daniel woke up sometime after noon to the smell of bacon. Brian and the Hulk were both absent, and the house was quiet, save for the bird song that filtered through the walls. Wandering into the kitchen, he could see the remains of a breakfast for two. There was still some bacon and eggs, set aside on a platter with saran wrap plastered over it. Daniel peeled the filmy plastic off and spent a few minutes rooting through the drawers before he found the silverware, then spent a few more minutes hunting up a coffee cup. At least there was coffee, kept hot, and vast stores of cream and sugar. Daniel scarfed down the breakfast with the ravenous appetite reserved for people who have gone more than 24 hours without eating. He drank 2 whole cups of coffee, which was very good. Brazilian, maybe, or Moroccan. He sat and looked out the window at the hills and trees outside, the blue and cloudless sky, the 2 small electric cars parked in the gravel driveway. The blood on the gravel. The house was still as silent as the grave. Daniel got up and rinsed his dishes, then left them to soak in the sink, unsure of what else he ought to do with them. He stood for a moment in the center of the kitchen. Wood and tile, real marble countertops, small and cozy like the rest of the house, and wondered what on earth he was going to do. Brian and the Hulk had gone somewhere. Hopefully neither was murdering the other, but the way this week was going, anything was possible. Alan was alive, or at least had been at 5 a.m, but likewise nowhere to be seen. Odds were the 3 of them were somewhere in the house, and he could find them simply by looking. Still, wandering around a stranger's house made Daniel uncomfortable, especially when one of said strangers could crush his head in one hand. However, there being nothing else to do, Daniel started looking. He hunted through the downstairs first, finding very little, and certainly nothing in the way of clues. Down the hallway opposite the kitchen, there was a small office with a desk and chair, a lamp, and stacks upon stacks of paperback books. The next door down was a sunroom that looked out over the ravine in the backyard, kitted out with an easel and paints, brushes, pastels, charcoals, and pens. Drawn on the canvas currently residing on the easel was a very large and very veiny penis, superimposing an aborted sketch of the landscape outside. There was a little laundry closet with a washer and dryer, a fold-out ironing board screwed into the back of the door. Across the hall from this was a storeroom with floor-to-ceiling shelves on every wall, with a gap for the window. All the shelves filled with neatly organized med kits, each kit labeled by a small placard on the shelf beneath it. Daniel purposefully excluded the downstairs bathroom from his search. There were bound to be bloody handprints all over everything. He realized his shirt was stiff in places with Alan's blood, and yanked it off. He threw it into the laundry room, much preferring to shiver. He'd had enough of blood. Across from the kitchen, set into a small alcove, was a locked door. A cold draft wafted out from underneath it, and lights were on behind it, but there was only silence from within. Daniel shivered, his hand on the knob. "They're not serial killers, Daniel," he reminded himself. Well, probably not. The only other door led outside, down a small set of stone steps to the vast, untamed forest. Daniel didn't bother looking out there. He was unlikely to find anything and highly likely to get lost. The upstairs was smaller than the down, consisting of a bedroom, into which Daniel only cursorily glanced, wary of seeing things he couldn't unsee. A large bathroom with what appeared to be a jacuzzi, another room dedicated primarily to books and comfortable places to read them, and the little home theater he and Brian had made use of the night before. And everywhere empty and silent. Where the hell is everyone? He muttered to himself, cupping his elbows in his hands as he stood in the hallway, scanning the walls as though they might provide an answer. Downstairs, the front door opened and closed. Daniel darted halfway down the stairs, then stopped. Someone had stabbed Alan in the lung. Someone was trying to kill Daniel. What if they'd come to finish the job? "Daniel?" came the Hulk's rumbling voice. Daniel shook his head, rolling his eyes at himself, and came the rest of the way down the stairs. "Hey," he said. The Hulk looked him up and down. "Need to borrow a shirt?" he said. Daniel looked down at himself and blushed all the way from his hips to his hair. There was, a lot of blood on it. The Hulk smiled tightly. "Need to borrow a shirt?" he asked again. That'd be nice. Probably not one of yours, though." He chuckled like a landslide. "No, don't think so. Hang on a minute." He padded off towards the laundry room. Daniel was still wondering whether or not he was supposed to follow when the Hulk came back. He tossed a white shirt at Daniel, who just barely managed to catch it. "One of Alan's," the Hulk said, by way of explanation. "Probably fit you." "Thanks," Daniel said, slipping the shirt on. It was too narrow around the shoulders, as he'd expected it to be, but it was better than nothing. Daniel looked up at the Hulk, intending to ask how Alan was doing. "Where's Brian?" he asked instead. He resisted the urge to flinch. "Took him home this morning," the Hulk answered. "He's dead," Daniel's mind supplied, unbidden. "They'll never find the body?" "That's stupid," he retorted internally, "and you know it." "Oh," said Daniel. "Will he be safe?" The Hulk shrugged. "According to Alan." Daniel's heart leapt. "He's awake?" "Was, earlier. Lost a lot of blood, though. Want to talk to him?" "Yes," Daniel said. If anyone knew what the hell was going on, it was Alan. Despite any evidence to the contrary, right then it felt like he was the only one of the crew Daniel could trust. The Hulk beckoned Daniel to follow, which he did. He led him down to the locked door and unlocked it with a key from his pocket. There was a set of stairs leading downward, and a smell of antiseptic. The Hulk led Daniel down into a white, brightly lit room, its walls lined with cabinets and refrigerators. Alan was lying propped up on a bed, a thin tube feeding blood back into his arm from an ovoid plastic bag hanging from a metal stand. "Welcome to my lair," he said, grinning, as they entered, although his voice was noticeably faint. "Jesus, that shirt looks terrible on you. Can you even lift your arms?" "Where'd you get blood?" Daniel blurted. Nice, he thought. Not, "Hooray, you're alive!" Not, "How are you doing?" Not even, "Hello, Alan, that was some fucked up shit last night, huh?" Nope, just, "Where'd you get blood? Nice to see you have your priorities in order." "Oh, I've been stockpiling my own blood for years," Alan answered. "He has," the Hulk confirmed in a rumble. "Goddamn paranoid." "Excuse me," Alan said curtly, "but who would be a widower if I weren't, quote, unquote, goddamn paranoid?" The Hulk's face darkened. "Not funny," he said. "No," Alan retorted. "It isn't." Daniel looked back and forth between the two of them, massively uncomfortable. I can leave you two alone," he offered. "No, don't." Alan sighed. "Dylan, I need to talk to the kid. Would you—" "Already gone," the Hulk said, and stalked out, closing the door behind him. Alan sagged in his bed, eyes closed, face drawn. "Sorry about that, Gonzo. We're having a bit of a tiff." "Gonzo? Seriously?" "No, forget it. Just Alan being Alan." "About what?" Alan shook his head. "Not important. We'll work it out. Come here, sit down." Daniel crossed to the bed and sat in the wooden chair beside it. "It's come to my attention that you have not one single clue about what's going on," Alan said, "and that seems highly unfair, seeing as most of it appears, for one reason or another, to center around you." Daniel's eyebrows nearly touched his hairline. "It does?" he said. "Apparently. Beats the hell out of me as to why, though." "Before you start," Daniel said, where's Brian?" Alan looked at him slyly. "I had Dylan take him out back and shoot him." Daniel's heart stopped. "Kidding," Alan said gently. "I was kidding." "That's not funny." Daniel gasped, embarrassed and queasy. "No, it wasn't," Alan admitted. "Sorry, I don't do well with this whole... Never mind. Dylan took him back to the train station this morning. I think he expected you might piss yourself about it, so he told me to tell you butt-ass. Not sure why, but there it is." That sounded like Brian, all right. So at least he'd been all right when he'd left. Daniel would just have to take Ellen's word for it that he still was. "Is that safe?" Daniel asked. "Sending him home?" "Sure," Alan said. "But if people are trying to kill me just for knowing about the project..." Wrong. No one's trying to kill you for knowing about 9441. "They're not?" "No, dummy, or they would have killed you Thursday night when they had the chance. You think they let you go because they felt bad about killing a kid? No way. They let you go as a calculated risk. It just so happens that they calculated wrong, but that's beside the point. Knowing about 9441 isn't what put you on their hit list." Daniel put a hand over his eyes. "It was calling the keepers," he said heavily. "Bingo." "Wait, How do you know all of this? Daniel asked, looking up at Alan sharply. I have my sources. No, Daniel said. That's not good enough. For all I know, you could have been the one with a gun to the back of my head. I want to know how you know. Alan regarded him carefully for a moment. All right, he said at last. I have wiretaps on the whole Peacekeeper radioing system. I have a program that transcribes it for me, and then I zippy it every morning. Zippy was a program that allowed, through some brain science trickery, for a person to read at something like 500 words per minute. It was therefore not inconceivable that Alan really could browse an entire day's worth of Peacekeeper radio in just a couple of hours. It would be an insane amount of information to take in, but not impossible. Your name came up Friday morning, Alan continued. I don't know what happened before you called the Keepers, although by the looks of you it wasn't pleasant. But I do know that people take a terrific amount of offense when they tell you not to call the Keepers, and the first thing you do is call the Keepers. So how do you know it was about 9441? You told me 3 minutes ago. I did? As good as did. You thought Brian was going to get killed over it, and then you said the project, so I made an educated guess and you didn't correct me. Want to tell me the long version of your side of the story? No, Daniel said. I really don't. It'll help a lot, Alan said. Some other time, Daniel replied. The Keepers are already working on it. The Keepers are a bunch of trained circus animals who have learned to love the whip, Alan quipped. Daniel's fists clenched in his lap. My father was a peacekeeper, he said softly. I know, Alan replied. And if something like this had landed in his lap, do you honestly think he would have ever caught the sons of bitches who did it? Daniel's mouth opened, but he said nothing. He was thinking about it now. Would his father have brought those men to justice? Would he have caught up to them? Of course, he said, but he didn't sound very certain. Listen, Daniel, I'm sure your dad was a great guy, okay? But I know what the Keepers are like on a very intimate level, and I know they're not going to get these guys. Not soon enough to keep you alive, anyway. Daniel sat in silence for a while, staring at his hands. He'd always had his father's hands. Good, strong hands, honest and dark. So what happened to you? Daniel asked. Alan sighed. Well, that's a bit of a long story, but since you don't have anywhere pressing to be, I guess I can tell you the whole story of the affair. Really? Daniel looked up at Alan, who was wearing his customary smirk. Really? Alan said. I am no stranger to the tit-for-tat interplay of informants. I tell you my story, you tell me yours. Fair? I'm not your informant, Daniel said. And I'm not yours. But you want to know what happened to me, and I want to know what happened to you, so why the hell don't we just tell each other and stop being such enormous pricks about the whole thing? Despite himself, Daniel smiled, letting out a little cough of a laugh. Sure, he said. All right, then. Glad we can both be adults about this. So after I dropped you and the brain off at the rail station, I went to go do a little more digging on who exactly it was who wanted you dead, and how the hell they found you. Wait, if you knew someone was trying to kill me, why didn't you come to the NDC until, 9 at night? Alan rolled his oakwood eyes. Look, Gonzo, you gonna let me tell the story or not? I had other things to do, okay? Let's just say that I wasn't idle and that I was reasonably confident you'd still be alive by the time I got to you. There he goes with the Gonzo thing again. Daniel thought, but he said, "All right." So, I went to an informant, nice lady, sells crystal for a living over on 8th, and politely inquired if she knew anything about a kid getting snatched Thursday night. Daniel looked down at Alan's knuckles. He didn't know why he'd expected them to be bruised, but they weren't. Maybe the phrase politely inquired had a different, more literal meaning to Alan. And she did, as it happened. 2 men snatched the kid right off the street, she said. Tranked him and then hauled him off. I asked where they hauled him off to, and she said she didn't know because they threw him in a car. And now that was interesting, because who the hell has a car in the middle of San Francisco? And so I asked what kind of car it was, and guess what she told me? What? Said Daniel, who was too shaky to do anything but play along. Even though Alan's description was casual and light-hearted, there was no covering up the absolute, stark terror of that night. It was a keeper car, Alan said. Daniel blinked a couple of times, uncomprehending. What? A peacekeeper patrol car. Yep. Stuffed you in the back and drove off like nothing was wrong. She said the 2 guys weren't keepers, although, really, without their uniforms, nobody looks like a keeper, so they might have been. She didn't say that last part, that's just my commentary on the situation. They might have been keepers. Anyway. Is that why you don't think the keepers will catch them? Daniel asked, his heart in his throat. One of those officers in his home, might have been the one to hold a gun to his head only minutes earlier. Thank God there had been so many others around. Otherwise... No, but it certainly wouldn't help, Alan said. They don't like going after their own. Don't like looking fallible. Anyway, she didn't know anything else about it, so I went off to see if I could figure out where they'd taken you and why. At that time, I didn't know it was about the project, and clearly you can see that my investigations down that route bore no fruit. All I know for sure is that they took you home afterwards, which is disturbing enough on its own. Daniel hadn't thought of that. Whoever they were, they knew exactly where he lived. They'd been in his house. They'd carried him to his bed and tucked him in. He felt like he was going to be sick. There wasn't enough air in the room. Daniel, Alan cautioned. Breathe. Daniel shut his eyes and took a deep breath, letting it out shakily. Sorry, he said. What the hell are you apologizing for? Alan asked, bemused. Jesus, kid, it's a damn miracle you're still upright, all the crap you've been through in the last week. Chuckling weakly, Daniel shook his head. It's just, this kind of thing doesn't happen in real life. Sure it does, Alan told him. Not to people like me. Who do you think it happens to then? The thing is, Gonzo, everybody thinks they're people like me, because everyone is ordinary in their own little way, and that kernel of ordinariness makes them feel safe, because these kinds of things don't happen to ordinary people. But they do. Everything happens to ordinary people, and then you just have to hitch up your ordinary pants and deal with it as best you can. Daniel took another deep breath, waiting for the shaking to subside, and then asked, So how the hell did you get stabbed? Oh, that, said Alan, as though it was an unimportant detail. Unrelated incident, I'm afraid. Old mistakes coming back to bite me in the ass. Or the lung, as it happens. Wait, so when did that even happen? Oh, around 1:30, Alan answered. On the train? Daniel cried, incredulous. Technically on the platform immediately after the train pulled out again, Alan said. They left me for dead. He snorted. Amateurs. You don't leave 'em until their heart stops. Admittedly, I probably shouldn't have been driving in my condition, but I didn't really have much of a choice other than curl up and die, which is not generally my preferred option. Jesus, Alan, why are people trying to kill you? Alan tapped the side of his nose. Now that, I'm afraid, is not your business. You've got enough to worry about without getting involved in my extracurricular activities. Suffice it to say that this particular thing had nothing to do with you. Now, since I'm a curious and tenacious little bastard, what the hell happened to you? He had to swallow a few times. Maybe if he tried to tell the story with the same light-hearted tone of indifference that Alan had used when talking about nearly bleeding to death, he'd be able to stomach it better. Or at least shake less. They snatched me off the street, injected me with something. I woke up in a small room, smelled like bleach. I couldn't actually see anything. There was a light in my face, and I was handcuffed to the chair. It wasn't working. His throat was seizing up. There wasn't enough oxygen. It was at least 90% nitrogen. He was going to suffocate again, and nobody would be there to save him this time. Hey, Gonzo, Alan said gently. Breathe, honey. You don't have to tell it all at once. Take it slow. Keep on breathing. You're safe here, all right? Nobody's getting in here with Dylan upstairs. Nobody and nothing is going to hurt you here. If you need to go outside for a while and breathe some outside air, that's fine. I'll keep. Take your time, Gonzo. Gasping, Daniel replied, Why do you keep calling me that? What, Gonzo? Short for Gonzales. My name's Rodriguez. I'm aware, but calling you Rodro sounds fucking stupid. Daniel gasped out a laugh. Yeah, it really fucking does. But why not just Daniel? I like nicknames. Call it a quirk if you like, or an idiosyncrasy if your vocabulary allows for it. Why do you think everyone calls Dylan the Hulk? I picked it out for him. Seemed fitting. So how come you call him Dylan? Well, because everyone else calls him the Hulk. Duh. It's not mine if everyone else is saying it. I like having my own names for things. I settled on Gonzo for you because I like how it hangs on you. You look like a Gonzo. Do I? Trust me, I'm an expert on Gonzos. Daniel spent a few more minutes breathing. Okay, he said. I'm okay. All right. So, I woke up in the room. There was someone there, but I couldn't see him. There was someone else, someone behind me. They put a gun. He leaned his elbows on his knees and tangled his fingers in his hair, tugging against the scab on the back of his head, starting to cry again. You're still here, Gonzo, he assured Daniel. Still here, still in one piece. Keep on breathing. It took him another couple of minutes to pull himself together. Why was this suddenly so hard? He'd spat it all out to Keeper Rivera without a single stutter. They asked me everything I knew about 9441. What it was. They wanted to know what the watchwords were. Then they told me not to tell anyone and tranked me again, and then I woke up at home. He wiped the tears off his face, sniffling. Jesus, they were in my house. Alan said nothing, and Daniel looked up at him. His face was hard, his jaw clenched. He suddenly looked not like the affable, sarcastic con man Daniel had met, but like a hardened killer. Alan? Daniel said. Alan looked over at him and relaxed somewhat. The smirk crept onto his face, apparently without conscious effort. "Sorry, Gonzo," he said. "It just makes me furious that somebody would put a kid through that. I really appreciate you telling me all of this. I know it wasn't easy, but hey, Gonzo, listen to me on this one, all right? Don't try to push it down. Don't try to hide from it. It'll pop back up when you least expect it and hamstring you. Let yourself be shaken up over this. Admit you're scared and know that that's okay. Bottling up things like this is how people end up with PTSD." Daniel tried to focus. He put his head in his hands and breathed, slowly and deeply. "Okay," he said. "All right, I'll try. That's all anyone can do." "But you said that everything seemed to center around me, so what was that about?" "Yeah, I did kind of say that, didn't I?" Alan admitted. He sighed. "Well, Gonzo, it's like this. What happened to you was not random. Not by any stretch of the imagination. They knew who you were, where you'd be that night, where you live, and that you'd looked into 9441. Whoever they were after you and you specifically. And they must have found out about you somehow." "I can't deal with this," Daniel said, curling in on himself in his chair. "You're gonna have to," Alan said, "but not right now. There's more to tell, but not right now. I'll try not to die before you can handle the rest." Daniel just nodded. "Could you go get Dylan and send him down here? He and I need to talk." After a few deep breaths, Daniel replied, "Sure." Shakily, he got to his feet, trying to keep his face composed. "Thanks, Alan." "None needed," he replied. "If you need me, you know where to find me." He nodded again and tottered from the clinical cellar, reeling with the blows he'd just been dealt.